So that concludes the 14th India-Japan Annual Summit, which has taken place. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Prime Minister Kishida of Japan met. They've discussed a whole range of issues. 6 agreements were signed. Some of them include in the area of diplomatic notes and SEPA, Memorandum of Cooperation and Wastewater Management, some on industry and trade, and also in housing and urban affairs. But some key aspects are of clean energy, 5 trillion yen investment target, and sustainable development for the Northeast. We are joined by Professor Harsh Vardhan Pant, Distinguished Fellow of the ORF, for further inputs and perspective. Professor Pant, so what do you think are the key takeaways from the statements made by the two Prime Ministers?
This was something that one was looking at for some time now, that here is a new Prime Minister of Japan, and his first bilateral visit abroad, and post-pandemic, looking at the new global realities, new I think situation arising, and I think Prime Minister of Japan spoke very categorically about the challenges that he thinks the region faces, and of course the partnership that he has envisioned for India is a very ambitious one. The economic partnership, I think there is a lot of focus on the economic partnership, which I think should be the order of the day, given that these two are going to be the pillars of, as Prime Minister of India put it, prosperity, along with other things, progress and prosperity and peace in the region. And I think the key element here would be what Japan and India are able to do economically, and therefore we have seen a lot of emphasis on economic cooperation between two countries, whether it is Japan looking at investments in India, Japan increasing that investment rate in India, whether it is about infrastructure development, or whether it is about India and Japan looking at the region more strategically coming together. So I think with this visit, what Mr. Kishida has done is to underscore that the ambitious outline that his predecessor Shinzo Abe had laid out for India-Japan relationship, he remains committed to it. He's taking it forward. He's willing to build on it, and he's betting on India in a very big way, which I think Prime Minister Modi again underscored, that India also looks at Japan as one of its key partners, whether it is for stabilizing the region or whether it is for the larger economic prosperity of the region. So I think very positive, relationship and very positive developments here on a number of fronts, in particular on the economic and trade front, I think.
So clearly the relationship is being taken to new heights, and we can see that certain areas have been highlighted. One was energy supply. This is a stable, secure, predictable energy supply which has got to be clean, and that we have a clean energy cooperation, which is the new part, a clean energy partnership. That is one of the big takeaways mentioned from this particular summit. How would you look at this changing the way the world is going to look at energy? Because if some of the major consumers are looking at stable supplies of clean energy, what does that imply?
I think energy and supply of clean energy is going to be the most important issue in terms of the global economic restructuring post-COVID. And that is something that we are now increasingly looking at major powers focusing on. And as I think we are looking at the current situation evolving out of the Ukrainian crisis, and as the center of gravity shifts to the Indo-Pacific, where you have countries located which are not only rising dramatically economically, but also their requirements in terms of energy are so huge that unless the developed world, which includes Japan, start looking at the energy and the energy relationships with these countries in a dramatically different form, I think the energy situation is not going to be eased. I don't think the challenge for the global energy environment that we are witnessing today will going to be any more strengthened, and is going to change in any significant way. And I think that's the point in some ways where India is arguing that, look, India is at a point where global inflation is just coming back into play, especially because of the high energy prices, because of multiple crises around the world, at a time when Indian economy and several other economies in the world were just beginning to come out of the COVID phase. And
Yes.
so when you look at post-COVID environment, when you want to build the post-COVID global economic order, the challenges I think for countries like Japan are how can they help countries like India navigate this phase, and in particular, not only providing sources of energy, but providing clean, clear sources of energy, which are going to be very important from various perspectives, not simply in terms of geopolitical changes that we are witnessing, but also in terms of the larger economic architecture that we are willing to create on the basis of clean energy. And I think those are the debates which very, I think, refreshingly we are finding that India and Japan are talking about. And Japan, of course, has a long-standing relationship with India on a number of fronts. If this front becomes another, if this front adds another dimension to this relationship, it will be for the better of India, Japan. It will be for the better, and I think India and Japan both will be the beneficiaries, given that both require energy and both are at the center of Indo-Pacific, where a lot of these energy debates are going to emerge and are already emerging. And the present crisis, I think, is clearly a warning that unless something is done about these issues, these will remain hanging. And I think that's why the partnership between Japan and India on this particular issue is not simply a bilateral partnership, but also an exemplar for the rest of the world as to how two countries with some differences on these issues still can match their requirements.
And how would you look at this $5 trillion target, I mean 5 trillion yen target, I beg your pardon, 5 trillion yen investment target? What is, it's a large sum and it's spread over 5 years. How would you look at, how it's going to be prioritized?
Very, very, I think, important milestone that the Japanese Prime Minister has laid out, and commitment I think that he's laying out for the first time, clearly putting a target as to what he expects Japan will be doing over the next few years. And I think this is important because often we have heard this debate that, look, India and Japan are progressing enormously when it comes to strategic ties. But when it comes to economic ties, when it comes to trade ties, India and Japan are not doing that well. And I think that's something that both India and Japan have today at the front of their agenda. And what Prime Minister Kishida is doing is basically laying out that agenda very, very clearly and explicitly, that he expects that this target will be met by Japan, or Japan will try to meet this target. And let's remember that this comes at a time when global geoeconomics is passing through a change, when countries want their, the over-reliance of Japan, or countries like Japan on China has come under question, when Japan wants to diversify. And I think what we are looking around today, India is emerged as one of the biggest, one of the most attractive destinations. So I think it's very natural for Japanese leadership to push its corporate sector into acknowledging that, into making India its most attractive destinations. And I think the politics of it is also interesting, that as both India and Japan want to move away from their over-reliance on China, both are looking at each other as reliable partners, and partners for long-term peace, prosperity and progress.
You did talk about geoeconomics, but what about the geopolitics? And they both referred to the challenges that the world is facing, and not only just about post-COVID, but also the new geopolitical challenges, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but because of the Ukraine war. But the point is that Japan is looking for a world free of nuclear weapons. That's one of their biggest agendas, right from the time they were bombed in Hiroshima. And in fact, Prime Minister Kishida represents Hiroshima in Parliament. So the point is, how would you look at this? I mean, this is a big agenda for them to try and bring a world which is free from nuclear weapons. Do you think India can work with them on that?
I think philosophically, Mark, there is no difference. India has for a very long time emphasized its commitment for global universal disarmament. And that is something that is, I think, very close to the hearts of all Indian, we have seen Indian leaderships over the years committing themselves to it, and including the present government and present Prime Minister. But I think that the challenge here is that the world is also changing very, very dramatically, even as we speak. And Prime Minister Kishida, of course, and Japan, of course, has been, the only country that has faced the wrath of nuclear weapons and the horror of I think, of those weapons is something of, is such an integral part of the historical memory that I think it's very natural for them to work towards and to make it a very pivotal point of their agenda, and successive governments have done that. But I think what is also changing in Japan is that there is a realistic assessment about the ability of Japan to pursue this agenda as well as to shape the strategic environment. So when you say a global geostrategy, global geopolitics, Japan today is not the Japan of 1960s and 1950s. Japan today wants to be a primary player in global geopolitics, and Japan's investments in defense, Japan's role as a defense provider, that is becoming very, very critical. And I think that is where this assessment as to what Japan can and cannot do on the nuclear question becomes important. I think Japan certainly will continue to lead this movement, and India will continue to support that movement. But I think India's response has always been categorical, that unless the countries that have attained nuclear capability for the, to begin with, unless they commit themselves to nuclear disarmament, India will not be the first to give up nuclear weapons. We want nuclear world devoid of nuclear weapons, but our security concerns, because of the neighborhood that we live in, also prevent us from going down that route unilaterally. So I think we want a multilateral framework through which this consensus should emerge, and India is favorably inclined to work with Japan on this question. So I don't think there is a philosophical difference. There are operational differences in terms of how that can be achieved.
So looking ahead, he did say that, we haven't met at this level since 2018, and then his Prime Minister Kishida says is committed to taking the relationship forward, moving forward, and he talked about the ministerial 2+2 level dialogue. There are various other dialogue mechanisms in place. There is the defense ministers meeting, there's the NSA level dialogue, there's high level functional engagements, there are G2G and B2B interests in the fields of defense, economic transformation, investment, digital startups, disaster-related infrastructure, healthcare, etc. So what do you think? I mean, where is the relationship going from here?
I think, Mark, what we have seen in the last few decades, and especially in the last few years, the relationship, there is only one direction in this relationship is going, and that's upwards. I think we have seen a dramatically altered trajectory of this relationship. There are two things which are important. One, I think, the larger structural reality in the Indo-Pacific is changing so rapidly that India and Japan have to be on their toes to manage that. And the two are like-minded countries. The two are pillars of Indo-Pacific in more ways than one. And I think, therefore, their commitment to bring about positive change in the region is commendable and very integral to the way Indo-Pacific is going to evolve in the future. But the second fact, I think, is that successively we have seen Japanese prime ministers devoted to India-Japan cause. Especially I think since Mr. Abe, we have seen this commitment to India, which is quite interesting. And similarly, in Mr. Modi, we have seen a leader who is committed to making Japan integral to India's vision of the Indo-Pacific. I think the kind of commitment we have seen from the top level in governments on both sides makes it virtually imperative that the two nations are going to come together, and all the dialogues that you mentioned ensures that there is now an institutionalization of the relationship at a level which India has with very few countries. Quadrilateral, trilateral, bilateral, at the bureaucratic level, from NSA, MEA, defense, and this is a relationship which is enmeshing the two countries ever so closely together, and that means that our ability to pursue converging interests is going to be in more ways than one, much more comprehensive than it was ever in the past. And therefore, I think if you're looking at this relationship even from outside today, you will find that there are very few relationships that India has in the world today that are as integrated with India's vision of the globe, India's vision of the Indo-Pacific, as India-Japan bilateral ties. And after this visit, I think this visit has further underscored that whoever be the prime minister in Japan,
yes.
The parties in power in Japan, the fundamental reality is that with India, the relationship is going to be taken very seriously, and India is going to be at the heart of their vision for the Indo-Pacific and the changing global order.
So we are expecting the Ministry of External Affairs to be briefing us on this in a little while. So we'll continue to to put it into perspective. We know that the Prime Minister also mentioned about the UN and other multilateral forums and cooperation there. We are seeing convergence of the two countries, but India's national interests are basically dependent largely, since we are an importer of oil. We are, keenly that could affect us. And the Prime Minister has also made statements, or not, the Ministry of External Affairs has come out saying that countries that are basically in a position where they are energy surplus can impose sanctions, etc. But countries which are not are going to be at the receiving end. So, how would you view the the post Ukraine scenario and this relationship?
There are differences certainly on Ukraine. For example, when as part of the Quad, we have seen India taking a different position. But I think that is to be expected, given that Australia and Japan both are alliance partners of the US. India is not. So
Yeah.
India will take an independent view of the situation, of its own interests, of the realities on the ground, and of course its own partnership with Russia, which is of a different kind than, say, the partnership that America shares, or Japan shares, or even Australia shares with Russia. So clearly there are differences. Those differences have been explained by India. But where I think India is on a strong wicket in terms of the energy question, and clearly the Russia question, the Ukraine crisis, has exposed the fundamental vulnerabilities in global economy when it comes to energy, when it comes to energy supplies, when it comes to energy disruption, and any crisis of this kind puts pressure on countries like India, which are still in a developing phase, which are emerging out of the pandemic,
Yes.
and which need stable energy supplies to maintain their economic growth. And I think there the question that India is asking increasingly is that let's take a more holistic view of the energy situation around the world. India or other countries like India should not be targeted for aspiring to have stable energy supplies at a time when this is fundamentally integral to the way their economies are going to transform themselves. And this is, we are talking of poor economies, vulnerable because of multiple disruptions around the world. So to target them, especially by the developed world that are energy self-sufficient in more ways than one, they have alternative sources of energy, they have technology which they are reluctant to transfer. So for them to preach countries like India that or to target countries like India on this question is clearly not in the larger interest of global economic recovery. And
Yes.
India, I think, has made this case very, very categorically. India has made this case not only to its in multilateral platforms, but also to its partners like the US and Japan. Now, US and Japan are integral to India's vision of the Indo-Pacific, but
Yes.
when it comes to issues like this, India is well within its right to make an independent assessment of its requirements and to present them to countries like
Sure.
Japan, which are close friends. And I think the way this aspect is emerging now is that here are countries with which are largely like-minded, but they have differences on certain specific issues.
Right.
And India cannot really be expected to toe American line or any particular line on any issue, regardless of its national interest. And I think that is something that
Sure.
India has been conveying. And on the energy issue, because it's so integrally linked to the way we are looking at our own economic recovery, this message has gone out clear to all our friends and partners.
And indeed, India is also looking for investments, especially in the manufacturing sector, especially for our MSMEs, in components and supply chains, resilient supply chains. The economic order, in a sense, is changing as far as supply chains are concerned. Because the world was so dependent on China in the COVID period, this is what was this change was likely to take place. And this is an opportunity, in a sense, for Japan to, invest in Indian talent, because Indian talent exists in several of these core areas. But looking long term, what would you think? If they are bound by sanctions and things like that, would that impact their investments?
I don't think so. I think Japan is really interested in Indian talent. Japan, and I think the fact that Japanese Prime Minister is now talking of a sort of a clear target for investments in India is a recognition that if you're looking at the geo-economic environment today around the world, India is at the heart of it. If you
Yes.
want to have a supply chain resilience program, if you want to have if move away supply chains from China, from a country like China, then India has to be at the heart of any such initiative, and therefore Australia and Japan, along with India, have this supply chain resilience initiative, because there is a recognition post-COVID that you cannot be over-dependent on any particular country, especially a country like China, and that recognition is changing the way we are looking at supply chains, and we are looking at global economic restructuring. And as that economic restructuring moves forward, Japan, for a country like Japan, India will be an important partner, and this is a long-term issue. And, it has often been said that one of the reasons why China became China was because they had the backing of Japan. Japan was the first industrial powerhouse in Asia and in the Indo-Pacific, and then China came along, and Japan actually helped a lot in the rise of Chinese as a global economic behemoth. And I think the changing environment means that Japanese companies, Japanese corporate sector is relooking at their relationship with China. And as they do that, they have to come to terms with another country, which is India, where
Yes.
for all the problems of the past, India presents a future that is much more optimistic, where there are more opportunities in every sector of global economic endeavor. And in particular, as you were talking, Mark, about
Yes.
India's Make in India initiative, India's manufacturing capacity. It
Make
has
in
to
India
be,
for the world.
there is a clear target that Indian government has set for itself, and Make in India is at the heart of India's manufacturing rejuvenation, and Japan has to be part of that because of our close relationship with Japan and Japan's need for its companies to invest abroad.
So we've talked about energy security for both our countries. We've also highlighted some of the key aspects of manufacturing and MSMEs. There are frontier technologies for startups like 5G, data analytics, blockchain, Internet of Things. So this is one area that will probably go forward. Also, there is connectivity with the Northeast, for which I think there is sustainable development of the Northeast is one of the aspects that has come out of this particular summit as well. How do you look at that particular aspect in terms of Japan's interests converging with India's as far as development of, let's say, the whole of the East Asian project and India's Act East policy?
India's Act East policy, ever since, of course, first it was Look East policy and then it became Act East policy. Act East policy since 2014 has a very strategic dimension. We want our relationship with our East Asian partners, with our Southeast Asian partners, not simply to be primarily economic in nature. Economic is, certainly we started off in the Look East policy as economic partnerships. But we want that economic rationale to be underpinned by a strategic rationale. And that is, I think, at the heart of the changing geopolitics as well, something that we were discussing earlier. As countries come to terms with this need for looking at globalization through a different lens, that you really cannot have a situation where one particular country dominates all the supply chains, where you are dependent on one particular country for all the imports, where you are where one country is so pivotal that any act by it becomes disruptive to the whole ecosystem. As we move away from that framework, India's Act East policy actually is very well positioned to take advantage of this, of this changing political and geo-economic environment. And therefore, Japan, being our long-standing partner, has a special role to play there. And Japan has been playing that role for a while, both in terms of providing India an opportunity to expand its footprint in East and Southeast Asia, as well as working with India in third countries. So we have been looking at India-Japan initiatives in countries like Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh. We have been talking about the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which has not progressed as much as perhaps India and Japan would have liked. But I think the ambition there is something that India can only share with a country like Japan. So there is a larger dynamic here in terms of India's own ability to shape its eastern geopolitical environment with the help of Japan. And Japan's, I think, the sense that, look, we need to become a more quote unquote normal player in the larger geostrategic environment. For a long time, Japan was confined by its constitution to play, to become an economic player, but not a strategic player. I think gradually, bit by bit, those constraints are being taken away, though not, that is a huge debate within Japan itself.
Yes.
But if you see, for example, under Shinzo Abe, and if you see now under Kishida, we are looking at a Japan that is keen to play a proactive role, and that suits India very well in terms of its own Act East policy and in terms of its own bilateral cooperation with Japan. So one hopes that as both India and Japan look at a very, very fresh geostrategic environment around themselves, they'll be able to stabilize their partnership and take it to new frontiers.
And with the renewed interest in the 2+2 dialogue, we can see that defense cooperation is becoming key once again. In terms of one looked at it largely from the point of view of the Indo-Pacific theater and the maritime domain. But do you see more other aspects of defense cooperation emerging?
Defense cooperation, I think, is one of the most interesting stories of India-Japan relationship, because that has been, largely away from limelight. It's a slow process, and of course, as we were discussing, Japan was not really very keen on projecting itself as a defense player.
Yes.
But as Japan comes into its own, we have seen how visible Japanese presence has been around India's periphery, the kind of naval exercises Japan is engaged with India, and also with other partners, including the Quad partners and Quad plus partners, multiple partners, like-minded countries coming together and working with Japan. The kind of expertise that Japan has in naval warfare, very few countries have. So clearly for India and Japan to work together on maritime security is an area which is, I think, full of potential and is growing increasingly. And of course, Japan and India are working very closely in developing certain capabilities. India has been very keen that Japan becomes a co-producer, co-development of certain kinds of frontier defense technologies. And I think the 2+2 dialogue provides a very viable platform for India and Japan to work together, because that brings a strategic holistic mapping in front of us rather than breaking it into silos. And foreign and defense ministers working together, looking at their relationships, looking at the wider strategic map, perhaps can work out a long-term roadmap for India and Japan, something which I think is the need of the hour, given how rapidly things are developing every single day, even as we speak.
So talking long-term, Japan has already given us a 50-year loan for the Mumbai-Ahmedabad high-speed rail link, and also there are various other projects that are still underway. There's the industrial corridor, the dedicated freight corridor. So these are Japan's investments are long-term as far as our infrastructure projects are concerned, and also with regard to the projects that are completed, such as the Delhi Metro. We can see, a totally different, an economic transformation in a sense from what things were before and after the Japanese inputs came in.
Yes, if they were an ideal partner, you would say Japan is that ideal partner that can really bring in the kind of expertise that you need, and especially India, as it was transforming, from in the last decade or so into a high-end infrastructure and economy. That's where we have seen Japan plugging in key technologies at critical junctures in critical sectors. Of course, we all know Delhi Metro, but there are beyond Delhi Metro, as we are looking at today, the bullet train project. It is a clear recognition that India and Japan share such a comfort with each other when it comes to sharing technologies and sharing expertise, that this has become a relationship which can only grow in the future if you're looking at the demands that India has in terms of its infrastructure development. But also interestingly, it is also India and Japan working together in third countries on infrastructure, which I think is also a response to China's huge BRI. When you look around the
Yes,
world and you
yes.
see that no single country has that kind of resource base, that kind of expertise, if you bring India and Japan together, then the possibilities grow phenomenally. And that we have seen, for example, India and Japan trying to work out mechanisms of enhancing infrastructure connectivity projects in Asia, in Southeast Asia, and all the way to Africa through Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. It needs a greater push, but we have also seen third-party, projects like in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh being envisaged. And I think Japanese technology, along with India's experience, this is a potent combination, and in some ways that combination should be leveraged much more effectively by the two nations. And you see this being referred to during this meeting as well. And one hopes that this is taken forward, by the two countries, by the two leaderships, as well as by those nations who expect India and Japan to bring in technology and expertise in developing their infrastructure. Also as an alternative to what China is offering, that is also leading to a lot of problems in a number of countries. So I think both within India, where there are enormous infrastructure requirements, Japan has been a key partner plugging in those gaps, and also together India and Japan have a very massive agenda in front of them to reach out to those countries that need it, that need transparent, bottom-up infrastructure development that India and Japan are well positioned to provide.
So this 14th summit comes also in a milestone year, which is the 70 years of the diplomatic ties between these two countries. And we can see that, symbolically it could mean something, but it has also when the countries want to highlight this and create opportunities based on the these milestones, what does that indicate? I mean, that the relationship is is designed with some sort of a vision where for the future, because they're looking for plenty of opportunities on both sides at this time, and there are institutional setups to try and see this go through. I mean, because it is a jubilee year.
Yes, indeed, this is a milestone year. In some ways, a moment to reflect and moment to see how far we have traveled. At one point post 1998, it was all doom and gloom as far as India-Japan relations were concerned, when Japan had imposed sanctions on India because India had tested nuclear weapons. But I think if you look at that journey post 1998 to 2022 today, it's a remarkable journey in a relatively short span of time.
Absolutely.
Not only has that memory forgotten, but also there is a new momentum in the relationship, which is quite extraordinary if you think, if you look at how bilateral relations with other countries have been, have worked out or not worked out. But both in terms of Japan's own vision for its role in the world in the Indo-Pacific, India's vision for itself in the Indo-Pacific, and India's attempt to engage like-minded countries like Japan. This has been a phenomenal achievement, and I think both nations can be proud of what they've achieved in the 70 years that they have been working together. And
yes.
Now, as we look back, there can be a lot of satisfaction, but also clearly new milestones to be laid out. That this should not be something that we can rest our laurels on. This should be something that we need to build on. And I think that the two prime ministers today, when they spoke, it was clear that they want to build on the legacy that the two nations have created. They want to lay out a long-term roadmap for this relationship. And the fact, as you point out, the fact that this is one of the most institutionalized relationship in the world.
Okay.
As far as Indian foreign policy matrix is concerned, as far as Japanese foreign policy is concerned, there are very few countries that are as institutionalized bilaterally with each other as India and Japan are. And that means that there is a mechanism that exists to envision a relationship, to envision a partnership that can be much more ambitious. And as I think Prime Minister of Japan today pointed out, by putting on the table a definitive roadmap for economic cooperation, by saying that this is the amount he expects to invest,
Yes,
Japanese
absolutely.
companies to invest in India. This is clearly an indication that the two nations are working together for the long term, and they recognize the challenges that they face as well as the opportunities that they have created for themselves.
And talking about recognition, in fact, I was looking at some Japanese websites and which are translated in English, and they acknowledge that India's iron ore has played a significant role in in the industrialization of Japan, in basically transforming Japan from World War II's destruction. So they are quite, that's something that. Perhaps they thank India for, and we can see the kind of investments they're putting into India. And you did mention after 1998 what happened, and then in 2000 the Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihiro Mori came to India, and Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee at the time. Then we set up what is called the Global Partnership, and now it's become a special strategic and global partnership. So it was just 2 years that the whole thing, the mood changed in a sense.
Yes, indeed, and I think that also shows you the commitment that the two nations had for each other, despite the challenges, despite the principal difference that they had on India testing nuclear weapons. It was, very soon it was overtaken by the two leaderships in both countries that were willing to give each other a chance. And I think they were also far-sighted enough to recognize the changes that were happening in the region. It's one thing to recognize it. It's one thing to understand each other's concerns, but it's one thing to put in place a partnership that can map out the challenges of the future, and that's what India and Japan have done actually. In more ways than one, they have, these countries, their engagements, their institutionalization of the relationship has also been a roadmap for things much bigger and much wider and much deeper. Like, for example, the quadrilateral security dialogue, which is much talked about these days.
Yes.
But it would not have been possible without India and Japan laying that foundation of the construct of the Indo-Pacific as well as their bilateral relationship. It was Shinzo Abe who talked of the confluence of the two seas. So in some ways, the two nations have been at the very center of the global politics evolving in the Indo-Pacific and the relationships.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Harshvardhan Pant. Thank you for enlightening us on the deeper aspects of this very prominent and very important relationship between India and Japan. Thanks for joining us. And with that, we conclude this special program, and news and updates continue here on DD India. Do stay with us. Namaskar. And let me just once again thank you for joining us. Thanks very much. Namaskar.